In a way, it worries me a little that what is true for all of academics, what is true, in fact, for all of cultural practice in a formal sense, is equally true of science. Yet there is a kind of implication there. Science requires something extra, and that it's probably part of the primacy argument that science needs to be up there with a capital S. Now, this is of course a strange argument, a discussion we're having here, because we live in times when both that notion of science with a capital S and science with a small s are equally endangered. And perhaps that's what we should talk about next.
So it's interesting that you bring up the science with a capital S and the science by implication with a small s. In the first place, as we said, the co-option of investigations in how the world works, let us define for the moment that as science with a capital S. Okay. Investigations of how the world works, both for political and for economic reasons, begin to be co-opted as elite activities in common with other branches of scholarship, of academia, and, dare one say, of culture. And therefore, in that sense, we are still talking about high culture and low culture, high brow and low brow at the very least, and the inevitable connections between the tensions between those two and the tensions between what you would consider the high science and a scientific tempered perspective that's driven by high science versus what I mean when I talk about my objections to current popular science and my argument about what needs to replace that as, if you like, science with a small s, to reclaim what communities do as lived lives and the decisions that communities make, the provisional, tentative decisions that they make, looking at the world, judging probabilities, and acting on them. Because without acting, you don't live lives, even if you're wrong. What you do is learn from your mistakes.
This is an interesting notion of lived science, because certainly to us, the phrase lived culture means a great deal. When you're talking about diversity, it could just be a kind of, paying lip service to a motto, unity in diversity and so on. But all you need to do is look around you and there is a lived diversity, a lived culture with numerous narratives, counter narratives and so on. So for us to understand what lived science actually looks like, if you look at it in the face, would you describe that? Because you know what lived culture is, Satyajit.
Let me respond to that in the form of a story, of a narrative, if you will. So we in the subcontinent and across the world have had communities that have had illness of a variety of kinds. And we have dealt as communities with that illness, with that range of illnesses, in trial and error ways. Some plant somebody found that does something to help. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. There are times when you take the plant when it seems to work a little bit better. We really have had no idea of how all of this happens. But over generations of community lives, we have some tentative empirical connections that if we do such and such, then illness A or B is alleviated to some extent. If you think about this, you will discover that implicit in this narrative itself is the idea that it's an open-ended enterprise, that contemporary medicine people would learn new things that their predecessors hadn't worked out. In the process, they would discover that some things that their predecessors thought were right, really not right. And they would change the tradition. you build, in effect, an empirical process of open-ended learning. And yet, it's a lived tradition of healing, of interventions of a variety of kinds. Now, you introduce an elite intervention. You say, we write this down, and it becomes knowledge that is both secret and sacred. And once you do that, you make it unchangeable. You freeze it in time, not thoroughly, but you disconnect it from the communitarian, progressively self-correcting tradition. You now restrict, contain, and deform it into an elite tradition.
So you rob it of its dynamism.
You rob it of its open-mindedness. You rob it of its empiricism, in the sense of, if reality doesn't correspond to what we think, then we are wrong. And let's change that attitude. You effectively convert the communitarian scientific temper into scripture.
There's an interesting parallel, of course, with culture, which is what happens when the Ramayana, for example, becomes a sacred text.
Book rather than a narrative
and in fact,
tradition.
it's not even allowed, the sacred text is not allowed to coexist with the literary text, and instead it becomes the authoritative version.
Absolutely.
And then you shut the door and say, here it is within the sanctum sanctorum, and you will have to sort of gain admittance there, and a certain number of people will have access to it.
Exactly.
So it's interesting, because one tends to think of the relationship between science and culture in terms of the common goal of intellectual progress, and I will claim that for culture, which is not often claimed, because obviously you're writing a novel, you might be writing about what people call emotions, but really it's a form of intellectual progress. So if knowledge is the object, and observation, analysis, etc., what you might call the scientific method, is part of our lives, would it be overstating it to say reason holds it all together?
Terms like reason, or its second cousin, rationalism, are slippery ideas. So terms like reason or rationalism are somewhat slippery ideas. So I'm a little careful when attempting to position them in these kinds of what I keep calling tentative understandings of what we are about. With that proviso, yes, it would be very much that reason holds it all together. But we need to keep in mind that what we mean by reason is the ability to, as I said, look at reality, to test it against our current beliefs, and if there is a discordance, to change our belief rather than pretending that reality is not what it is. To use an American verbal trick, what I call the scripturalization of open knowledge. Think about how we would respond indigenous knowledge and knowledge systems. And if they were open systems that have been disregarded, it is deeply appropriate for us, not simply that it's integral to radical politics, to bring them back into societal discourse, to give them their due, but giving them their due as open systems, subject to interrogation, subject to living modifications, lived modifications, is one thing. To bring them back as valorized claims to either elite or even subaltern traditions that are fixed, frozen, and unchangeable as icons is a whole different matter altogether. My argument, the narrative that I used, is a narrative that one can interpret as a commentary on the Ayurvedic tradition, where we have lived traditions of tested, empirical, pragmatic, self-correcting, healing based on such understanding of the world and such resources as are available to communities, and not simply the codification, but the sacralization of that code. That means that subsequent investigations of the lived kind are no longer contributions that lead to self-correction of the tradition, but are restricted to providing validation and justification for the scripture. And if you think about that in terms of how all revisionist politics looks at scientific traditions, that's what is done. You want our glorious traditions to have had already transplantation, you want those traditions to have had deep and esoteric knowledge that other systems are only now beginning to discover. This tension between a frozen, sacralized, scriptural authority that we now simply, all our science is, or at least ought to be, an effort to validate and valorize rather than use as part of today's living traditions of knowledge. That's what I would argue discriminates, and I would argue this both for science and for culture, discriminates between revisionist politics and radical politics.